Good morning, everybody. Appreciate you coming out today, and special thanks for Sans for having me out here. Also, just want to say what an amazing event. So many awesome speakers, folks that I look up to, new speakers that haven't had the opportunity to present before, but do awesome research. I know Ed's keynote is going to be awesome tomorrow too. Unfortunately, I'm not going to make it. He's leaving my keynote in 5 minutes anyway for a more important call, he said. So we'll see how that goes. But no, I really appreciate Sans having me out here. It's really a great opportunity. So this talk, Research Adversaries, is one that I really enjoy because it's talking about how things have changed over the past 10 to 15 years and what we should be looking for moving forward. Now, if you look at security today, it's still extremely complex, and it's really afforded to those that have dedicated security personnel. You know, you look at small to medium-sized businesses. I think Microsoft had a stat recently where 92% of their customers still aren't using multi-factor authentication from Microsoft 365. You know, you look at those stats and you're like, that's pretty abysmal and a base level control that we have to look at. And so security, when you look at how attackers continuously are evolving, they're leveraging the same types of methodologies that we use in the security industry. I mean, they have researchers, they're buying security products and testing out their attacks against them to circumvent detection controls. They're, you know, doing more targeted attacks versus kind of the mass blast that we used to see before in the past. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of commodity and things like that out there, but you know, when we start looking at how adversaries are preparing and moving forward and being successful at what they do, most companies still have a very tough time handling customized attacks across their infrastructure. And that's what we're really going to be talking about today is, what are these adversaries doing? What does it look like? What do the technical controls that we have in most organizations look like today? How are those easily circumvented? And then what do we do to bring security to the masses out there? Just a brief introduction to myself. I have been in the security industry for 24 years, which seems like just yesterday, and it means I'm getting old. But it's an amazing time. I've had a great amount of time in the security industry. I started 2 companies in the basement of my house. I had no idea what I was doing. It's actually a pretty funny story. My wife was pregnant with twins, and I was a chief security officer for Diebold. I came in before the voting machine issues. Just want to throw that out there. Or came in after, sorry, not after, not before. I said that completely backwards. I came in after the voting machine issues, and I built their global security program. And I was like, listen, I went to my wife and I'm like, hey, I really want to start a company in the basement of our house. And she's like, you literally have a perfect job. And like, you know, we're like doing good and I'm pregnant with twins. I'm like, yeah, but it sounds like a really good idea. And she's like, okay, we'll figure it out. And so we started TrustedSec and then eventually Binary Defense. And now we have over 300 folks worldwide helping people out, which is an awesome thing. So took the risk and did well. Been on the news quite frequently, believe it or not. On the top right, I was in a Chris Brown rap video. No idea how that happened. I'm in the background, basically pretending to be a hacker. There was really no hacking going on, but it looked cool. And then testified in front of Congress. I'm on the news quite frequently. I helped out with the TV show Mr. Robot. A lot of the stits and stunts that you see from hackers and the cool stuff like that. We got to create some really neat stuff. And I'm into lifting. On the bottom right is one of my favorite passions, is helping other folks out. And I graduated from a school called Bedford High School, which the net median income there is $30,000, which is well below the national average. So a lot of poverty-stricken areas, things like that, inner city type of district. And I built their esports gaming facility, which created 15 new full scholarship opportunities for kids out there in esports. So when I was a kid, I wasn't big into sports. I played with computers and programmed MUDs and learned C and C++ on my own. And never really had the opportunity of doing sports. And so like esports is kind of a neat way to make friends and do things and play video games at school, which I never thought would be accepted, which is awesome. And then do some good stuff there. So, and I also own a DeLorean. It's fully converted to the Back to the Future machine, and it breaks all the time. So it's in the shop right now. They're not great, well-built cars. And it definitely doesn't go to 88 miles per hour. I'm lucky to get 45 on the freeway. So definitely was a Porsche engine actually in the movie. So they had to put a Porsche engine in it to get to the 88 miles per hour, if you didn't know that. So the news stuff is fun though. I'm on the news quite frequently on Fox and CNN, CNBC. I do all news media equally. I don't talk about politics, just specifically cybersecurity. But one of my favorite stories before I kick this off was, you know, fairly recently during the Iranian tensions that were going on with their nuclear program. They were concerned about nation state attacks from Iran on critical infrastructure in the United States. So they brought me in as a expert to talk about, you know, what Iran's capabilities were from a nation state perspective, which is fine. I'm comfortable with that. And when I go on the news, I actually get more nervous talking in person than I do on the news, believe it or not. Because like the news, you're just like looking at a camera screen. You don't really realize, hey, you're talking to like millions of people or whatever, and it doesn't freak you out as much. So I'm on the news, and there was two segments. There was an Iranian nuclear expert that was like a UN, like nuclear expert, like 50 years of experience with the United Nations treaty with Iran and all this other stuff. And then there's me, that's the cybersecurity expert. And they got the segments mixed up, and they introduced me on live TV as an Iranian nuclear expert. And I don't know if anybody's ever been in a position before where it's like, you're like, oh my God, what's going on right now? You're like, and you can't just like leave. So you panic. And I started sweating, by the way, in places that I didn't know was possible. Like, I mean, first of all, your armpits started sweating, so I'm drenched in sweat. My nose started sweating. It's possible for your nose to sweat. My ears were sweating. I didn't know that was possible. Sweat from everywhere. I'm like beet red, like instantly my body goes into fight or flight. And, you have an option. You have one option, which is, correct them on live TV and say, hey, I think you got the segment mixed up. I'm the cyber guy. I don't know anything about this stuff at all, like nothing. Or you try to BS your way out of it. So I panicked and I tried to BS my way out of it. And it did not go well. So they're like, so Dave, what do you think about the treaty of 1982 with the blah, 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 blah? I'm like, yeah. So, oh, shoot. Yeah, what about that cyber stuff though? I'm like, oh, no, Dave, we have a cyber guy coming on next to talk about that stuff. I'm like, that's me, please help me. But luckily, like about 45 seconds into it, as I was crashing and burning, I can hear the producer saying, that's the friggin' cyber guy, you idiots, So I'm like, okay. I got off within about a minute or so, and they skipped the whole cyber segment and didn't bring the UN nuclear expert guy on because they had messed up. But you learn different things as you go along there, as you go into those situations. But I'm not here to talk about that. When we talk about today and what we face today, it's actually really interesting, and it's different than what we experienced 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there wasn't this massive amount of money being made through ransomware groups. In fact, I made a really bold prediction that was completely wrong. And I said ransomware was just going to be a fad. And boy, did I get that wrong. And that's fine. I didn't realize that these ransomware groups, would start off small, start to make some money, invest in their infrastructure, invest in specialized skills, invest in research, and start going after bigger targets and start to make more and more money to where we have this problem today. In addition, you have ransomware groups, most specifically in Russia, that kind of work both on the government side as well as the ransomware side as well, kind of hand in hand. So all of this stuff has changed very drastically, and corporations and companies have changed drastically. What's interesting about 10 years ago, when we used to do penetration tests, we'd go into a company and offense was kind of this magical, mythical creature. We'd go in with all these awesome tools. I'd write tools on site because the first day I break into a company, have full access to their infrastructure, no detections, have domain admin and have access to all their databases, infrastructure, and intellectual property. And then, the rest of the week was writing new releases for the social engineer toolkit or Magic Unicorn or whatever it ends up being, because it was just that easy to break in. And then you'd walk and high five each other, and then you'd write a report and the company would fix the technical findings. And the next year you do the exact same thing, and it was just a cyclical effect of offense always winning. But what changed, fairly recently is that we started focusing less on the technical findings of the technical vulnerabilities and focusing more on how attackers go after an infrastructure. And I think, Lockheed Martin's kill chain of visualizing how attacks work. And then, what birthed out of that was, the MITRE ATT&CK framework and being able to say, okay, well, tactics, techniques, and procedures, these are how attackers operate. Let's focus on initial access. Let's focus on privilege escalation. Let's focus on lateral movement. Let's focus on all of these components that attackers do. And so we started getting better at defense because we understood how offense worked. And so when we understood how offense worked, we started building better defenses, and then offense continues to innovate and try different things to get around those detections, as we see with adversaries and everything else. And I gave a talk with a friend of mine, Kevin Mitnick, back in 2014 at DerbyCon, talking about what we called adaptive pen testing, which is what we see today. Going into an organization, understanding how they operate, understanding their capabilities, and building attacks against their capabilities and trying to get around them, right? And it's very different than the penetration tests that, well, we still have penetration tests that are vulnerability assessments. Then you have customers that are like, hey, I don't want a penetration test, I want a red team. And then they're like, you don't want a red team, trust me, like you're, at a very low bar when it comes to security. It's not going to be helpful for you. So the definitions are still loosely attributed, but for the most part, penetration tests have evolved quite a bit, as have red teams for more mature organizations. Now, what's interesting is, from a red teaming perspective, I would say that out of all the customers that we test, less than 5% of them are able to handle what a red team actually is, which means that the bar of security that we have in the industry is less than 5% that can handle really a targeted attack from an adversary that has good capabilities. That's not a high bar yet, is it? So we still got a long ways to go when it comes to the maturity of our organizational levels, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But we have seen major progress between red and blue. That combination of working together, where offense and defense work together collaboratively, that purple teaming aspect, is one of those things that has been amazing for our industry that really has catapulted and skyrocketed how we do defense. The EDR industry was really birthed out of that. More visibility and being able to say, hey, now I have telemetry data that I can now start to comb through and look at detections in a very interesting way. So we're getting better at visibility and understanding. But again, when you look at EDR products, for example, most of them are still in a kind of 1990s signature-based antivirus approach. It's just, signature-based detections off of, off of specific TTPs. You modify and manipulate them, or you spread them out over time. Or one of my favorite techniques, and this is a little story here. When I go into an organization that has a well-mature monitoring detection program, as in they've built customized detections based off of their own organization, they understand the behavior of their organization, right? Like lawbins are a great example. If you see regsvr 32 with specific flags, that's probably going to trigger an EDR. But if you split those up into a few different commands, it's not going to trigger on an EDR. However, if a company has baselined their environment and said, we never use regsvr 32 in our environment, anytime it ever executes, we're going to go ahead and trigger detection. So if you go into mature organizations, you can usually tell how mature an organization is based on LinkedIn and doing open source intelligence gathering. Most folks will put, hey, we've had, how many people do you have in your monitoring detection team? What partners do you have from an MSSP perspective? What products do you have? You can build out kind of a maturity level just from LinkedIn profiles around how an organization really is really doing. And so if you go into a mature organization, oftentimes I will go into it with the understanding that I'm going to be detected in some way, shape, or form. If I'm going to be detected in some way, shape, or form, can I tell a story to that SOC analyst that is looking at that alarm that doesn't raise an elevated level? And so if you go into that thinking, hey, somebody's going to read this specific alarm or detection, can I get around that human being? The story is a little bit different than doing heavy obfuscation and encryption and making things look super intense, or doing process injection or other things that you may do that may get detected. One of my favorite things is PowerShell. And everybody talks about PowerShell is dead from a detection perspective, right? I beg to differ. I would want them to see a PowerShell command. And what I usually do is I'll go to LinkedIn and I'll look at somebody in IT, usually a server admin, or anybody that's in the reports and exchange metrics type of stuff, or anybody that's in the PowerShell development team or programming development team. And I'll go and I'll find a really big PowerShell script that's online, either through Microsoft or through GitHub. And what I'll do is I'll put some comment code on the top of it and say, hey, this was written by so-and-so within that company, for exchange reporting metrics or for Active Directory, health and services. And then I'll sign it that person's name. And then, let's just say it's a 2,000 line of code piece of PowerShell that does whatever it does. I'll tuck my malicious code halfway through it. Now, if a SOC analyst gets an alarm with a 2,000 page PowerShell script that's signed by somebody within the organization, what are they going to do? That's a false positive, right? They're going to move on, and they're going to move on to the next situation. So telling the story to certain people can be heavily beneficial for organizations that you go into, and it's that continuous progress on red and blue that make us a lot better. When we talk about research adversaries, it's the same types of techniques that they're leveraging as well. What was interesting to see with the Conti leaks is that we started to see a lot of weaponization and tooling research. I thought the funniest thing from the Conti leaks that just cracks me up every time I think about it is that they had a help desk support. So you can go on a channel, and if you're having trouble breaking into a company from an illegal perspective, they had higher tier attackers that would help you break into that company and organization. And one of the ones, there was a attacker that was breaking into a company, and he landed on a Linux box, and he got stuck in VI, and he was trying to get in. And the translation was like, how do I exit this hell of an editor? And it was just perfect. Like even adversaries have trouble getting out of VI. So it's not just the security industry. But when you look at those capabilities from adversaries, they're purchasing products. They had purchased Carbon Black to make sure that they could get around their detection criteria for when they went and did certain types of attacks. So, we're seeing the same methods that we use in our industry applied very heavily from an adversary perspective, both from nation states and ransomware and organized crime groups and everything else that we see out there. So, what's interesting now is that ransomware groups now have the same types of capabilities as nation states. They're continuously evolving. Yes, they're changing. And yes, they shut down and rebrand or do whatever, but they're still weaponizing and tooling very similar to what we do. Lapsis is a great example. The recent hack for Uber, I love because, well, I don't love, it's obviously a horrible situation, but I love from an analysis perspective around how this actually occurred. Now, what's interesting about Lapsis is that there are a bunch of 17-year-old kids, and they're breaking into some of the most biggest companies in the world. They broke into Microsoft, they broke into LG, they broke into Okta, they broke into Uber. So they've had a number of successes going after large organizations that have dedicated security programs that, obviously Microsoft has an extremely dedicated security program. NVIDIA has a security program. Okta, Samsung, T-Mobile, Uber, Rockstar Games all have security programs. And they were heavily successful at being 17-year-old kids and breaking in. And by the way, not just a little bit of access, like some major breaches, right? LG, they had full domain admin access to their entire infrastructure. Uber, they had access to all their containers, virtual environments, cloud environments. Okta, circumvention to potentially multiple thousands of computers or thousands of organizations. So real successful adversary here from a group that is probably less sophisticated in nature. And this image is from Michael Kozwara, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. But he mapped the attack from the Uber hack directly to MITRE ATT&CK framework and went through the various stages. And what's interesting about this is that this attack is what you would see on a penetration test, hands down. Every single time you deal with a penetration test, you get initial access, you start looking at how do you bridge out from a lateral movement perspective? Can I glean any information off of the server or the system that I'm on currently? Can I use tokens that are available on my system? Can I use open ports and protocols to be able to get to a open file share or use credentials to be able to connect to a file share that I have access to from a permissions perspective? Inside of those, can I get to an intranet site? Are there passwords on there? Are there things that I can get into? I mean, it's the same stuff we do every single day in our jobs, and the attackers are doing the exact same thing that we do every single time in our job. So it's great validation from an adversary perspective. But what I thought was interesting about this is that push notifications have been problematic for a very long time. We need to burn push notifications down and out of this industry forever. They are not an acceptable method for multi-factor authentication, period. Push notifications, just to give you an example, if, this is a statistic internally from TrustedSec, and I should publish the data for it. If we do geolocation in the general location of the user that we're going after, which is not hard to do, obviously. So when we go through multi-factor authentication, you log into username and password, and it says, hey, are you logging in from, Washington, D.C.? If I'm in Washington, D.C., what do you think the stat is for success on that push notification for an allow? 94%. That's awful. And guess what it is if you try it more than once? 99%. So if they hit don't allow once and you keep hitting allow, eventually they get pissed and they're like, screw this app is screwed, I'm just gonna hit allow. And you're good. Push notifications are broke. Get rid of them, period, unfortunately. So what's interesting about Lapsis, same exact thing happened. So they had bought credentials for a compromised contractor for Uber, and they spammed the hell out of this guy, this contractor, for allow. And I think he denied him like 12 or 15 times. And on the 15th one, he just hit allow. Didn't report it. No one knew about it. Gave him full access to their VPN controller, okay? From there, once they had initial access on the VPN, they started scanning, looking for file systems, file servers with those credentials, found an open network share that had PowerShell scripts on it. That PowerShell script had hard-coded admin passwords for their Thycotic access management server, which gave them access to everything. Ouch, right? Now, there's a lot of people that were surprised on Twitter about this. And it's funny because you see the reaction of surprised people on Twitter, which was great to see that some people were not surprised, but 14% were somewhat surprised, very surprised. What's interesting is if you're a penetration tester or you're on offense, the things that you see on people's networks will make people terrified, right? That's why we don't sleep at night. That's why that's why we're up till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, is because the horrible, dark things that we find discovered on internal networks that allow us to get access to whatever we want to. But seeing hard-coded passwords in an infrastructure that was used for automation is not uncommon at all. Is it good practices? No, but guess what? Uber has dedicated security personnel. When you're as large of a company as that, your attack surface increases, the ability for people to not follow a specific process, for legacy systems and applications that are core to the business to still be allowed. We have all of these problems in our infrastructure. And then you look at like agile development, for example, where we're continuously iterating on code and pushing things out. And all of a sudden now we have, 2 years of stuff that really hasn't been gone through from a huge source code analysis perspective or dynamic testing of applications. We run into these things quite often. And so what's changed over the past several years is that we've seen these adversaries start to specialize in various different areas. Just recently, Evil Proxy released a phishing as a service, they had the phishing as a service component, but they introduced multi-factor authentication, circumvention, and bypassing into their service offering. So if you're, a ransomware group, a ransomware as a service platform, you might add Evil Proxy as a method to help add for multi-factor authentication, circumvention as part of your phishing campaigns that you do as you go after organizations. So the specializations in these groups start to make a big difference. Everything from the encryptors all the way to initial access and C2, all the way to how do you make the ransomware payments, very heavy specializations in these different areas. And so today, we have all this stuff, that makes us secure. We have multi-factor authentication. Again, 92% of companies aren't leveraging that, which is insane. Visibility and identification, minimalization of attack surfaces, both internal and external. We have zero trust, all the stuff that we, tout in our industry, but all this stuff takes a long time. Is anybody able to implement allow listing or application control in their environment within a month period? We laugh at that, right? Not possible, right? Zero trust. What does that even mean still, right? We know that it's a methodology more so of minimizing our attack surface and not being a service provider of all ports and protocols and things and moving more towards cloud-centric infrastructure. And what's interesting about cloud-centric infrastructure, does anybody here feel that they have equal or greater than visibility in their cloud infrastructure than they do on-prem? Not one? Okay. What's interesting about cloud infrastructure too, which is better, or which is interesting, is that, everybody was touting cloud as being more secure, right? You have, and I think there are definitely aspects of cloud that are easier to manage. Patch management, for example, vulnerability management starts to kind of go out the window a little bit. But the complexity and misconfigurations and research that goes into cloud infrastructure is just starting to surface now. And you have kind of a grace period of new technologies and platforms until things are standardized on and until researchers kind of go into it. You look at what Durkeon's been doing with road tools and being able to use that as an exploitation framework and analysis framework for Active Directory infrastructures in Azure AD. There's a lot of research now going into there, and you see adversaries doing the same thing. Russia, very heavy in cloud infrastructure. China, same thing. We start to see these groups, especially the more advanced groups, start to leverage these platforms for their attacks, recognizing that we have limited to no exposure. Going back a second, you look at Lapsis. Most of Lapsis's successes have been cloud infrastructure-based attacks. They fly in that sweet spot where we don't have much on the detection front, and then they go after those specific systems because there's no monitoring detection capabilities that they put in place. It's not to say there isn't monitoring detection capabilities, but most folks don't have very good cloud security detection. So let's talk a little bit about research adversaries. The monetary gains will continue to drive that. Now, what's interesting is that we've heard, hey, maybe there's ways through OFAC to disable payments to ransomware groups. What's interesting about that, and if you talk to any of the major politicians that would be part of that type of, I think, legislature that would have to be passed, and basically the blowback that would occur is that what's being proposed, which is going to probably die very quickly, is banning payments to ransomware groups. Now, that's an interesting concept, and I think it's a good idea, but think about what's going to happen at that period of time. So if we ban all payments to ransomware groups, now all the ransomware groups are going to be super pissed, which is fine. Like, we like making them mad. But then they would start targeting a lot of, especially US-based companies that have no ability to recover. So now you have big companies that will not be able to recover, probably go out of business. So that payment option now becomes a major pain where now government is active in private sector. All of this stuff means a lot of issues, but it's a short-term amount of pain for probably a long-term gain. But at the end of the day, I don't see that actually ever occurring or happening. So ransomware, I will I still see being here for quite a long time. When you look at the ransomware providers, again, the specializations continue to be a big issue when it comes to everything we find out there. And then we also see technology progression. That's the Gibson's our server room at TrustedSec. We have hacker names for everything. So we have War Games, Matrix, a bunch of others. And then we have Grand Siesta, which is our nap room. So you can take naps. But you look at technology progression on these groups, and what you start to see from GPU crackers and everything else. Again, it's becoming easier for a lot of these folks to be able to crack passwords or to have a data breach dump and use those. We just recently purchased 8 4090s, which I hear there's a fire issue now, so I'm like concerned that our server room is going to burn down. So we're going to see how that goes. But I do have a fire suppression system, which I don't want to use, obviously. But the 4090s are amazing at cracking passwords. So we have 8 4090s that are on top of our 8 3080 Ti's. So we're cracking passwords at like a ridiculous rate right now, which is awesome. But again, adversaries have the same access to some tools. Now, what I like about our industry is the research division, or our research side of the house, both on a defense perspective and an offense perspective. I know some folks don't like the release of offensive security tools or OSTs. I do believe that you have to continuously innovate in our industry so that we can continuously get better at defense and continuously raise the bar. The problem is that when a new tool comes out, like a good example would be Magic Unicorn. Magic Unicorn is a tool that I wrote a number of years ago. I update it here and there, but not as much anymore, because what would happen is anytime I release a public tool, and if it's a popular tool, it gets detected almost immediately. People will write signatures for it almost immediately, right? Now, what's interesting about that is that I wrote a fork of that privately 2 years ago. So I wrote Magic Unicorn, which is a x86 downgrade attack of PowerShell. What it does is it detects whether you're in a 32 or 64-bit platform, and then it executes PowerShell, injects shellcode directly into memory. If you're in a 64-bit process, it'll downgrade that process to a 32-bit compatibility mode. So I came out with that technique, and then a lot of the other tools adopted it afterwards, like Empire and those. So if you see like Syswall64, for example, executing PowerShell, it's usually a good indication that something's wrong. But with Magic Unicorn, I forked it and called there's a tool I wrote called Sweetcorn, which is an internal use only tool. And I redid how I did the PowerShell injection technique. Magic Unicorn I released, and usually within a few days, there's a new detection out for it. Sweetcorn I wrote 2 years ago, haven't touched it in 2 years. There's no detections for them. So, the public tools get detections almost immediately, whereas anything that you write that's private or manipulated in some way, shape, or form usually doesn't have a detection. You just have to continuously tweak it a little bit here and there to get around the detection techniques. What was funny was I was going through like a little bit of a pride contest with Microsoft a few years ago. And so when I released a new version of Magic Unicorn, they must have had one dedicated person to me, seriously, like 24/7 at Microsoft, because I'd see the hits from Microsoft's IP space. I'm like, okay, here comes the signature detection. Literally like an hour later, there's a new Defender's, signature written for me. I'm like, these guys love me. And I'd always talk a bunch of smack at talks, so I'm pretty sure they were watching the talks as well. So I wrote this program called Number 2, which I'm a Star Trek fan, so it's not Number 2, the other stuff. It was Number 2 for like Riker is like one of my favorites on Star Trek. Anyways, so I wrote this program called Number 2, and it hooks into Windows Defender, and it would automatically every 30 minutes grab the latest Defender signatures, inject into AMSI, and determine whether or not my Unicorn signature was getting detected. And if it did, it would automatically figure out where that signature was written for, rewrite my tool for me, and then do a pull request. So within 30 minutes maximum of a new signature, I had a new signature already circumvention, and that ran for like years, and I finally gave up on it because like they just literally had dedicated people to me the entire time. I'm like, okay, this sucks. So I don't update as much, but it's really easy to get around. But those specific types of things that you see, public tools versus non-public tools have a much longer shelf life. And if you can code something custom, your ability to get around detections for a long period of time is definitely out there. Now, what I always like seeing is that, you'll see researchers publish either a small blurb of something or a full research component. Then you see it being weaponized by red teamers, penetration testers, as well as adversaries. And most recently, we had been using this technique for quite a few, about a year or so around access tokens in Office products. And most recently, Mr. Docs, which is a great researcher, it's always cool to see his work, posted how to go and do this. So we released our BOF file for Cobalt Strike that allows you to do the same thing. And so what's really neat about this one is we released it both for 64 and 32-bit platforms. What's really neat, and Scott Nussbaum on our research team did a lot of the research for this a year ago and then released the tools. But if you're not familiar with what you can do with Office files, when you get initial access to a system, any Office product, Teams, Microsoft 365, Outlook, any of those ones, you can search your memory for the JSON web token or the JWT file. and then you can extract that JWT file from that initial access component and then replay that on a different system that doesn't require you to re-authenticate to Microsoft or Office 365. So you can basically log into their session on a remote system without having to go through multi-factor authentication or credentials, then have maintained access to Microsoft 365 while not having to have maintained access to their machine that you've already compromised. So just a neat tool that you can go and use. Here's an example of it here. Now, the BOF file, obviously, if you have a beacon file on the system or something to that effect, you can go and do this automated through the BOF object file, or the beacon object file. But we see here, we can see the Office token. And then all we need to do is take that Office token and then parse it and then replay it on the other system. We take our Office token, the JWT file. And unfortunately, Scott's using VI. So it's gonna be like an hour. We parse that JWT file, and then we have our full parsed Office token that we can replay on another system. So when you look at attacks and what we really have an issue with, it's attack customization. If you look at the MITRE attack framework, which is a phenomenal framework, huge advocate, huge fan of it, but the commercialized industry as well as the easy way out of things has been done with the MITRE attack framework, which is taking all of the techniques and then mapping that to one-to-one detections, which isn't bad in itself. You know, one-to-one detections is a great level of baseline analysis for hackers that don't understand how to manipulate the defaults, okay? Or to break things up from a default perspective. If you Google, you know, law bins and you look up msht8.exe and you copy and paste msht8.exe into something that has Windows Defender or an EDR product, it's gonna light up like a Christmas tree, right? But if you split that file up, split that attack up into a few different types of commands, like maybe the download functionality, you use bitsadmin or curl or, you know, Excel, which actually will download to the temps directory. And then you split that up and you use mshta to actually call that file locally. Most of the time, you're not going to get a detection. So if you know how to customize your attack in some way, shape, or form, you can usually get around what the defaults are, the one-to-one detections, unless they have a good understanding of their environment. A good example of this and customizing attacks is I was going after an organization. I was an insurance company, and I had spent about a week building out my pretext or my attack. I had found a cross-site scripting vulnerability in one of their HR applications online, their external-facing HR applications that was internally hosted. And once I had found the cross-site scripting vulnerability, I built a pretext against two individuals that I wanted to go after in the research division, their competitive M&A research division. So that was part of my trophy that the organization wanted me to go to, like M&A activity, that type of stuff that could impact them financially. And so I went to LinkedIn, I looked at these two people, went to their social media profiles, and I built a pretext from an HR perspective. And what's interesting is the attack was twofold. One, I wanted to capture their credentials, and two, I wanted to get remote code execution onto the system through something deployable from the second stage attack perspective. So I built all that out. Everything was working great, but I wanted to make the attack very believable. So the first thing I did was I didn't send an email to those two individuals. I sent an email to the corporate communications person. And I said, hey, you know, I'm a media person. I would love to do an interview about how awesome your company is and all this other stuff. And I just saw you just had this, you know, acquisition over here. Congratulations. Love to do a story on you. Corporate communications person sends me an email back almost immediately saying, we'd love to do a story. What information do you need from us and when can we schedule a call? Now that's all I needed. I just needed one email back. Now, does anybody know why I needed one email back from that person? Why did I need one email back? Not technical at all. Wasn't looking at their internal IPs, their headers, anything like that. What's that? A name to refer to? Okay, so taking that one step further, how does the template of their email look like, right? What is their fonts that they use, the signatures that they use? So if I'm going to send an email from internal HR, I need it to be as believable as possible. So what does their email signature actually look like? That's the first thing I did. So again, building a believable pretext and scenario that I want to go after. Then I sent an email to those two individuals and I immediately got 2 hits, okay? Usernames and passwords, everything was great. I messed up my code and I didn't get remote code execution. So totally blew that one out of the water, which sure we've all done that before, right? I just messed it up just a tweak and everything I tested, it worked fine. And then, you know, hit a weird variable and it doesn't work. So it didn't work. I didn't get my remote code execution, which is fine. So I'm like, okay, well, I got creds. Let's see where they don't have multi-factor authentication. And I found a Cisco VPN concentrator. I'm like, well, let me try there first. And the first thing I logged into was their Cisco VPN concentrator. And I logged in, and all of a sudden it said, hey, we're pushing a notification to you based on your previous settings. Please wait while we verify who you are or whatever, And I'm like, oh, crap. I'm like, there goes my whole pretext, like my attack. I'm going to have to burn the servers down. I'm going to have to go to a different space. I'm going to have to do a different attack. I'm going to have to target different people. It's going to be a late night. So I went to go get a bourbon, and I came back and I was logged into the VPN concentrator. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. I'm like, well, maybe I'm isolated or something. And I'm like, no, full network access. The user's like, hey, I'm probably logging in from somewhere. So they hit allow. Again, push notifications really suck. You want to know an even better scenario that you can do that has been very effective for us from a red teaming perspective is if you send a text message, because text messages are amazing, you send a text message to the person that you're phishing and say, hey, we're upgrading, and if you can look up on LinkedIn and look at what multi-factor authentication solution you're using, which making it more familiar. You don't have to use that, but if you actually use the technology name, it's usually more familiar. So let's just say they have, Duo Security, and nothing against Duo. Duo is awesome, just as an example. So they say, hey, we're upgrading our Duo security infrastructure. You may have to repair your phone for authentication based on our upgrade. So if you get a prompt tomorrow at between 9 and 10 p.m. or 6 and 7 p.m., make sure you hit allow so that you can still maintain access to your email. Cool. Then, next day, you hit your multi-factor authentication, they hit allow, you're all set. 100% success ratio with that type of thing, right? It's all about the story you tell. So again, these types of things, if you customize your attacks, have a difficult time to get around it. And most of our detections are built around initial access and not usually the latter stages of an attack. When you start looking at lateral movement, maybe when you start getting into the later stages, it starts to become harder and harder and harder to detect. Here's an example of circumvention of attacks, and this is through Magic Unicorn. Now, again, why I stopped doing it is because it's trivial to get a new detection around AMSI. Now, AMSI has been broken in many ways, shape, or form, so I'm not going to go into all of the stuff. You can patch AMSI so that it never scans in the first place. There's some great tools around that. Rostamous has a really good one that you can do there. But with AMSI, if you're not familiar with how it actually works, AMSI.dll is something that was implemented to get a clear understanding around what's executing through PowerShell. And what will happen anytime you execute a PowerShell script is that right before it actually goes to execute, in memory, AMSI.dll will take it and it'll say, hey, you need to come here first. And there's really two functions that are used, AMSI scan string and AMSI scan buffer. And the scan string is the one that's mostly used, and it'll be scanned by what's called the AMSI provider. Once that gets scanned, it says, hey, is this good or bad? And if it hits a known signature, it'll say it's bad. It won't allow it to execute, and then you move on. It's the same thing, by the way. And the reason I show this is that, yes, AMSI is very easy to circumvent, but these are the same types of detections that are built in monitoring detection tools, EDR products, and everything else. So if you know where the detections are, by manipulating or modifying in some way, shape, or form that attack so that it's not out of the box, you have a very good success ratio of getting around it. So here we're going to run Unicorn, and we're going to create a interpreter shell, which should be detected by everything out there. Base interpreter shell, no obfuscation, no encoding, nothing like that. It's just out of the box interpreter, which again, should be hopefully heavily caught very easily. We're going to have a callback. It's a reverse HTTPS shell. So over SSL or TLS, it's going to go to our IP address back here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to decode it really quick. So this is a technique that, so I gave the very first ever PowerShell security talk, which is a cool claim to fame. It was called PowerShell OMFG at DEF CON 13, I think. What's cool is Jeff Snover, the guy that wrote PowerShell, considers me the father of PowerShell security that kicked off the PowerShell security movement, which is a really cool title to have. I should put it in my bio. In here, we copy our decoded code, and we're going to paste it over here. We're going to create our listener on the other side to capture it, hopefully. Now, this is just our Unicode code, Unicode basic support code decoded. We execute it over here, and it's a little blurry, but it's getting stopped by the PowerShell interpreter. The AMSI provider is saying, hey, something's wrong here. What we're going to do here is we're going to remove this last line, and we're going to hit play again. And notice that it executes. So that last line is where the signature is written at. So all we're going to do is just split this command up into two different commands and see what happens. Can't be that easy. So we're just making it two different commands. And then we hit play. Get scanned through AMSI. Notice it executes and we get our shell. So it is that easy, right? So that's the fragility of our detections that we have today, figuring out where the detection's at and then rewriting it to get around it before we actually execute our payload on a victim's machine. Now, this is another example through Trevor C2, which is a tool that I wrote as well. It's a command and control that simulates browsing traffic. So it looks like if you look at the network traffic, even if you're doing SSL decryption or TLS decryption, it looks like somebody's browsing the internet basically in a normal way. So it tucks the instruction sets into the source of the HTML of the code, and it's dynamic in nature, so it regenerates it based off of the key that is given based off of session variables in here. Now, if you notice here, this is just recent. This is just a couple weeks ago. I decided to put Magic Unicorn up, and lo and behold, it actually gets detected. So let's take a look at how we get around that. Now, what's cool about Magic Unicorn is that it's not heavily obfuscated or encrypted or anything like that, so it actually looks fairly legitimate. Here we can see it's getting detected. So all I'm going to do is change two variables, one to moo and one to moo2, which is, I say you should change your variables, and we get around and we get full access around that detection. So again, super simple changing of the defaults in the application or tool to allow us to get around the specific detection criteria. That's Windows 11. All right, talk about that. You know, you look at some of these too, like Felina, everybody's panicking about. And what's interesting about Felina or MSDT.exe was that we knew that this was a problematic law bin several years ago. I think the earliest research was back in 2015, where you could do application control or application allow listing bypasses directly through MSDT.exe. The only issue was that they hadn't discovered the remote code execution component. So it was interesting when MSDT.exe came out, there was no detections off of any products that were out there whatsoever, even though it had been out for quite a long time. So again, unless it hits a certain threshold, most people aren't going to write detections for it. That's why there's so many obscure law bins that aren't in specific lists, people don't know about, still can actively use on a daily basis. Using already discovered research. So back in 2019, Sophos did a blog post about LastPass. And what's interesting about LastPass is if you look at the statement from Sophos, they didn't disclose or release any tools or anything like that. Just had a small blurb basically saying, hey, you can basically take the string that's left in memory and use that to decode the offline database password store and extract all of the usernames and passwords out of the database if you have access to memory. So just a tidbit there. So, you know, we actually saw that blog post and we released an internal tool that allowed us to go and do it. Well, most recently, some folks published that same research online, so we released our stuff as well. But what's interesting about LastPass is that there was a couple of issues with it. One, as soon as you log in, that hash value of your password is stored in memory, okay? And it's stored in memory for like basically ever, even if you're, if you have the, you know how if you use the Chrome extensions or whatever, and you're logged out of it, that hash value is still in memory as well. So even if you're logged out, you're not actually actively logged into your vault, that hash value is still stored in memory for, you know, until a reboot or until you shut down the computer. And so if you log into that, you can take that hash value, salt it, and then open up the offline master database that contains all of your usernames and passwords and extract all of those directly from memory. So again, just to, you know, not necessarily an issue with LastPass specifically, you probably should scrub that portion of memory. But if you have already initial access, just another tool that you can use to get access to it. So why is security so hard and why are we seeing these major issues out there? And to me, it's really due to the complexity of all of these things. So if you look at most organizations, they may have one dedicated security person, if not, you know, none, especially in the small to medium-sized markets. You start getting in the larger enterprise, absolutely start seeing dedicated personnel. Now you have to deal with such a massive organization that is changing on a regular basis, all the legacy stuff. Does anybody here not have meetings all day long? You got one? Oh my gosh, you're lucky. Oh my God. Wish I was you. So, you know, the distractions that we have for meetings upon meetings upon meetings to where we, you know, and the change control processes, and I'm not saying change control is a bad thing. I burned down Diebold one time on accident. Change control is a good thing, okay? I dropped our whole manufacturing process. It was for a good cause. I blocked all egress filtering, which shut down our manufacturing process, but that's a whole nother story. But you know, change control is a good thing, but these distractions that we have and having to deal with day-to-day fires and everything else makes this very challenging, especially from a technology perspective. So we have all these distractions, and security really is expensive. It takes a lot of time to implement behavioral-based detections or good detection engineering, good visibility in cloud infrastructure, allow listing or application control, all the stuff we want to do from a strategic roadmap 3-year perspective around vulnerability management and system hardening and configuration management, all this other stuff that we have to do. So we have to look at it and say, well, how the heck do we deal with all of these variables that are out there that it's going to take us years and years and years to do? And how do we supplement that with something that is going to be very fast moving, i.e. adversaries that are researching and coming up with new techniques all the time? So how do we fix that time frame in between? And the way that you look at that is visibility. If I had one position open in a company, probably the most important position today in a company, and I'm sorry, it's not red team. Although I love red teaming, it's detection engineering and threat hunting. That's probably the #1 most important position that we can hire for in companies today. And the reason for that is understanding your own environment and what can actually happen, and baselining your environment and looking for deviations of those patterns of behavior is so important. Because if an attacker changes in a tool or a technique and you don't have a detection for it, what's that behavior look like in that environment? Do you see workstation communication, especially from lower level protocols like SMB and RPC? Is that normal in your environment? Well, I don't know. Those are the types of things that we see. A good example, we had a customer recently where we had threat hunters actively looking in their environment, and we had baselined the remoting software that they used and noticed that on 2 machines, they had non-authorized remote software. It was still third-party commercial software, but it was on 2 people's machines that wasn't the company standard. Legitimate software, code signed, used by companies all the time, but still 2 pieces of software that didn't match the profile of the organization, behavioral understanding of their environment, right? So we started looking at that, and we notified the customer, hey, is this normal? No, it's not normal. We don't use this specific piece of software. So they contacted the 2 people that were impacted, and they had the story that they got from both of these individuals that had this remoting software was, we had somebody from IT call us and say we needed to install this remoting software on our infrastructure because our machines were experiencing issues, so we installed it for them. And it was obviously adversaries that were on their infrastructure environment. So it's those types of things that make a big difference, that maybe not emulate a Reg SVR32 or a Cobalt Strike beacon or something to that effect. They're using legitimate applications and tools against us to do the same types of things we would do from an IT and remoting perspective. So the biggest defense that we have is detection, because detection moves fast. Detection can move fast if you build your program that way. If you have the right sources of data, which is first and foremost, #1, baselining your environment, understanding your visibility points and where you need detections from. You don't need everything, but a lot of stuff is great. The more, the better. Storage is getting cheaper and cheaper. So can we identify things in our environment? Can we baseline and can we move on? And so baseline and monitoring becomes really, really important when it comes to living off the land, when it comes to edge cases around PowerShell exploitation, what we see from a parent-child process relationship. All of those things become extremely important in our environment to identify. So where do we begin? Well, preventative is going to take a long time. Like, that stuff isn't the easiest thing to do unless you're a small company. Smaller companies usually can implement things in a much faster rate because you have a lower attack surface, lower complexity, things of that effect. When you start looking at detective, having a good framework around to be able to ingest as much as you possibly can and look at what's normal and what's not. Processes are a great way to start. Baselining your environment, say, hey, let's take a list, of all of the law bins that are out there, and let's look at our environment to see if there's any of those. If there are, let's put exceptions in for those, and let's look for deviations of patterns of behavior. Don't look for specific flags or a TTP that is very specific. Make it your own in your own environment. There was one customer we went into where it was a red team engagement, and it was for a company where we had spent 3 months. It was what we call more of a longer term red team engagement. And so it took us 3 months to get remote code execution onto the system. We found a 0-day. We used our own C2 that isn't public. We're able to get remote code execution and get into this very sophisticated organization I consider probably on the 1% that we've ever gone against. And we're all high-fiving because 3 months of research, 3 months of effort, 3 months of going after this organization, we finally broke into their massive armor that they had from an external perimeter perspective. It was awesome. We're all high-fiving each other. And we ended up taking a look at just trying to figure out where we were at and who we were. And no, we didn't drop into a command shell. No, we didn't type ipconfig. No, we didn't type net user /domain. We didn't do a lot of the profiling things that would potentially trigger an unusual activity and environment that you see from a normal user. We called the API for who am I, okay? Which you thought would be good to see what user we're running under. Well, they had actually written a detection in their environment for technical and non-technical users. So if your title was something technical, they put you in a technical block. If your title was non-technical, and we were on a non-technical person, If there's any technical commands that were ever being executed on the system, it would trigger an alarm and the SOC analyst would analyze it. And literally, as soon as we did the who am I, they detected us, they moved us off of the network, and that 3 months of work was completely ruined. So we were like listening to Careless Whispers and a bunch of other horrible songs as we were crying in the room. So detections can definitely make a big difference if they're personalized to your own environment. So the last thing I'll end it with is that understanding offense makes a solid defense, but defense has to be able to move fast. And I'm not saying with preventative mechanisms because we can't make production changes live, but if we have a good baseline around understanding logs and sources and having the right types of data in our environment, to be able to move fast should be a process that we all implement in our environments. And that's our core defense right now, is that identifying things in the earlier stages of things to be able to respond to it. And with that, I want to thank you all very much for having me. Really appreciate it. And some amazing talks coming up. So I can't wait to see the rest of you all, folks. And thanks so much for coming out today. Appreciate it.